Welcome, everyone. My name is Dan Hedigan. I am the chair of the advisory committee for ESPRI, which is the Economic Self-Sufficiency Research Policy Institute. And this evening, I have the honor of introducing David Neumark, who is a distinguished professor of economics and director of the Economic Self-Sufficiency Policy Research Institute at UCI. He's previously held positions at the Federal Reserve Board, University of Pennsylvania, Michigan State University, and the Public Policy Institute of California, and is currently a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco and a senior research fellow at the Workers' Compensation Research Institute. He has made significant research contributions in numerous areas of labor economics that intersect with important public policy issues. His early work on wage equation decomposition led to efforts to better tie these measurement methods to underlying models of discrimination, and his recent methodological contribution on audit and correspondence studies is being rapidly adopted in new and ongoing studies. And I have to tell you what that is, because I don't quite know. But one of the things that he's also known for, and one of the topics tonight, is he's one of the original contributors to the minimum wage research, helping to pioneer the use of state-level minimum wage variations to estimate minimum wage effects. He's also a leading scholar on economics of aging and age discrimination, having authored numerous studies on measurement of age discrimination in labor markets and tests of alternative models of the age earnings profile. His current research agenda as part of his activities as director of ESPRI concerns the long-run effects of alternative anti-poverty policies on what we're broadly defining as economic self-sufficiency. So that's earnings, income, poverty, public assistance receipts, and that's really what ESPRI is looking at, is how do we have the most efficient execution of those things from a public policy perspective. And tonight, with his deep background in the minimum wage, the topic is using minimum wages to fight inequality and poverty. David.
Thanks. I could go with this. Oh.
Do you want the following program to make changes to this computer? I think we'll say no. There we go. Okay, good. Well, thanks, Dan. Thanks for coming. My notes are here. Good. So I'm going to run through what I've spent or wasted 30 years of my life on, depending on your perspective, in about an hour. A broad overview of the question of minimum wages and the use of minimum wages in fighting inequality and poverty. And I'll go for a little less than an hour, and we'll take questions, and we'll go from there. I noticed, I thought I had caught all the things in my slides I wanted to change, but there's a couple UK references you'll see, because I actually gave this in the Parliament building a few months ago, not to Parliament, just in the Parliament building. So I had to talk a little about the UK. And those of you who've been to the lecture series in the past, I will sort of, because this is a good pedagogy as a teacher, bring you back to things you heard in some of those talks, because there's actually quite a few tie-ins with what I'm talking about here. Okay, so first of all, this is a big topic now. Anyone who follows the news, and this goes back, I think probably really started before the last presidential campaign, knows that we've kind of made this shift in the US to a very high minimum wage environment. The federal minimum wage has not changed since 2009. It's still 7.25. But the federal minimum wage is increasingly irrelevant. 29 states, and I'm probably off one or two because this changes like every 2 weeks, but when I last wrote these slides and checked them a few months ago, 29 states have minimum wages above the federal minimum wage, ranging, I think the highest is DC, which is not really a state, I realize, but we'll call it a state, at $12.50. Cities have joined the parade. Seattle, which is a major city, and SeaTac, which isn't, have $15 minimum wages. New York State and California are going up to $15 over the next few years. There are, referenda. I was talking to a reporter today. There's a minimum wage ballot in Arkansas. This is no longer just, liberal New England and West Coast states, right? There are minimum wages going. I think Arkansas is talking $11. So across the country, including in the South and some of the so-called red states, we're seeing movement towards higher and higher minimum wages. So I want to kind of talk about what that means and why it's happening, whether the policy tool is addressing the underlying motivations for it, and issues like that. So first of all, what's driving the policy change? Why are we doing this? Why are we having this debate? Why is the Fight for 15 movement seeming to be getting so much traction? Why did Bernie Sanders endorse the $15 minimum wage, and then the Democratic Party in its platform endorsed the $15 minimum wage? Well, inequality has been going up. This is a depiction of that graph. You can see the vertical axis starts at the left-hand side around 2. This is the ratio of the median wage to the 10th percentile of the wage distribution. You rank everyone in order, lowest wage to highest wage, just working people. The person at the 10th percentile is a pretty low wage earner. The person at the median is right in the middle. So this is the ratio of wages of actually earnings for full-time workers to get around kind of hours variation between the median and sort of a low earner. And you can see it's risen a lot. A lot of that rise was in the 1970s and 1980s, and to some extent the 1990s. And then it's been somewhat flat. But this is a lot of what drives this outcry on some part, or on the parts of some, for a higher minimum wage. That the low wage workers have really not done very well relative to others. Now, if all boats were rising, right? So if real wages were rising at the bottom and rising even more at the median, we might not be quite as concerned, unless we just cared about fairness. But at the bottom, real wages have not been rising. Exactly how much they've been falling or whether they've been roughly stagnant depends on how you deflate it and all kinds of technical issues. But it's pretty clear that at the bottom, we have not seen increases in the sort of what you can buy with an hour of work is kind of the best way to think about it. At the same time, this graph is a little, it stops a few years too early, but the yellow line is the poverty rate. That's the percentage of individuals, I'm doing here, who are poor. And then the orange line is real per capita GDP, right? The sort of value of the output of the economy. You can see the Great Recession there where the orange line dips down, of course. But in general, what you see with this graph, and if I made it longer, it would look pretty similar, is that, of course, GDP per capita keeps going up, right? The country gets richer and richer and richer, at least on a per person basis. And the poverty rate is pretty stagnant. I mean, we had declines in poverty with the war on poverty in the 1960s, but not a lot. And it's kind of interesting when you think about this, because in the US, we use an absolute poverty measure, right? Some countries define poverty as the 25th percentile of the family income distribution, and then the poverty rate never changes because there's always 25% of the people below the 25th percentile. We have an absolute measure. It's kind of a weird measure. It's meant to be sort of a proxy of the resources for basic needs of healthy living, food, shelter, clothing, and the like. It was invented in the 1960s. It's actually 3 times the food budget of a low-income family, which is sort of a historical anomaly. But the point is it's absolute. So if a country gets richer and there's no change in inequality, the poverty should continually fall, right? And eventually there should be almost no one at the poverty line, except, of course, people who don't work. So the fact that you have a growing economy and fairly stagnant poverty suggests that maybe something is wrong. Now, obviously, this is a reflection of the rise in inequality. But anyways, I think people looking at the persistence of poverty have said, well, we should use the minimum wage to address that problem. Now, why have low-wage workers fallen behind? Usually 5 factors are cited for why we saw that kind of stagnation at the bottom or declines. One is weaker union sector. Private sector unions boost wages, we know that. 15% or so is probably a good estimate. Private sector unionization has gone from over a third of the workforce in the 1940s and 50s to less than 7% now. So private sector unions aren't really a thing in most of the private sector, in most of the economy. Public sector unions are big, but that's sort of a different issue. The second factor people talk about is international trade, globalization. What international trade does, of course, is increases. It has a lot of benefits, economists think. But you know, if you have scarce resources, scarce talent or ability or resources that work with those that other countries are complementary with, you do better. But if you're a very low-skilled worker, the result of trade is you're competing with more of those people from other parts of the world. You know, think about Apple, right? Creating an iPhone, right? The people who invent this stuff, who design this stuff, have all this, you know, all this sort of low-cost manufacturing capacity to now work with, and Those people, as well as the company as a whole, and anyone who owns their stock, of course, are doing better. But if you're the kind of person who does the jobs that puts iPhones together, you probably face more competition. So that's the second factor. Immigration is often cited. Obviously, it's a controversial topic. If you ask economists, it does, as it often does, it depends who you ask. You heard from George Borjas here a few years ago, who tends to be one of the hawkish voices in immigration, finding that immigration does push down wages of low-skilled workers. Others say there's no detectable impact. I think if you ask the people on the two sides of the debate, is there a common ground, they would probably say, in terms of wages, if it's bad for anyone, it's only bad for very low-skilled workers, and that is what we're talking about here. So there probably is something to that. Technological change, economists think, has moved in the direction of offering higher earnings for high-skilled workers who are complementary with computer technology and the like, and has made it tougher for low-skilled workers because it tends to replace the kinds of things they do. So those are four of the factors. And the fifth that people talk about, and it's of course the focus of what I'm talking about today, is the lower real minimum wage, right? The federal minimum wage, I told you, is $7.25. It's been there since 2009. This is a depiction of how some people describe it. It's the rich guy at the bottom, who I think is the same guy from the Monopoly board, if I'm not mistaken, says it's still not the bare minimum yet. And the point is that this graph is trying to make is that the real minimum wage has declined. Whatever wage floor, aside from these other things, trade, immigration, whatever you think of the evidence on those, the wage floor provided by the minimum wage has declined in real value. What do the actual data look like? Well, this is what the actual data look like. This is the real minimum wage in 2017 dollars. And you see a couple things here that are apparent. First of all, you see the sawtooth pattern kind of declines and then ratchets up. Why does that happen? Well, that's when the federal government raised the minimum wage, right? It jumps ahead. In the intervening periods, it declines. When there's high inflation, back on the left side of the graph, and the federal government doesn't raise the minimum wage, it declines a lot for obvious reasons. But you can also see that in the last, in sort of the second part of the graph, since around, I wish I could read the years on here, since around 1990, there's some fluctuations, but the real value has been fairly persistent, despite these changes. But for sure, when people say the minimum wage isn't what it was worth in the 1970s, this is what they're talking about. And as an empirical fact, that's certainly true. So if you just take these facts, they point to three reasons, I think, why we should, or some people think we should, raise the minimum wage. One, hasn't kept up with inflation, or real wages, other wages. Two, coupled with other changes, no one thinks it's the only thing, but coupled with the other changes I mentioned, it's the decline in the minimum wage has led to more inequality. And the third is that the growing economy has not sort of delivered the goods at the bottom, right? Poverty has remained roughly the same, despite a lot of increase in average income in the country. Those are the facts. So then we get to, okay, why raise the minimum wage? And I would say there are five contentions that come out of the minimum wage debate, or the advocates of it. I kind of cite here some of what the Fight for 15 folks talk about. This is what I gleaned from what they say. One, a low minimum wage is immoral. They often cite FDR, and I think this is the direct quote: "No business which depends for existence on paying less than living wages to its workers has any right to continue in this country." That's the moral argument. The second is kind of referring to what I told you before: the real minimum wage has declined, and the assertion that the real minimum wage shouldn't decline. Right? The fact that the simple argument that it has declined in real terms is meant to imply that therefore we should raise it. The third is that a higher minimum wage will counter the rise in inequality. That's certainly what people think. How, and this is the fourth and fifth point, a higher minimum wage will help low-wage workers, and a higher minimum wage will reduce poverty. So what I really want to do in this lecture is that was all background so far, is kind of go through all these five contentions and evaluate what we know about them. I'm not going to say much about the first three, because the first three don't have a lot to do with evidence, and the last two do. So let me just say a few things about some of these early some of the first arguments. This is the depiction of the immorality of minimum wages, with a low minimum wage and record level profits that we often hear about. I think as economists we are, well, we are, I was going to say appropriately or not, I'm not sure, it depends who you ask, but we tend to be cautious of those kind of statements. We draw this distinction, which we teach our students often the first day of class, at least I do, between normative and positive statements. The first is the distribution of income should be more equal. May be true, may not be true. It's clearly a normative statement. The second statement, we should raise the minimum wage to reduce inequality and poverty, is a bit of a hybrid, but it rests on what we call a positive conclusion, and that is that the minimum wage will in fact reduce inequality and poverty. Whether we should do it or not is, of course, a normative question. But there's an empirical assertion underlying this that or two really. One is that raising the minimum wage will reduce inequality and poverty. And the second, harder to answer but equally important, is it's the best way to do it, right? Because both of those are important. I think as economists, or as a labor economist who studies this topic, your view on the first bullet relative to my view is equally valid. I have no particular expertise on what the distribution of income should look like. I just have my own preferences, as might you. The second is something that empirical researchers wrestle with all the time, in particular the part that says, implies that a higher minimum wage will reduce inequality and poverty. But I think it's important as you read debate about this topic to realize the difference between between statements like a low minimum wage is unfair to a higher minimum wage is the right policy to get the desired distribution of income. You often lose the separation between those two things in the debate, and people often try to argue the second by pushing the first really hard, which is maybe because it resonates more with people. But they're two very different things. I have my students always write policy essays in my undergraduate labor class, and I always tell them, you can tell me your opinion, preferably at the end of the essay, but tell me when you're telling me your opinion so that I know that you know the difference. And some of them do, and some of them don't. But it is important. Okay, so that's kind of the first thing. Moral or not, I don't know, but it's all I can say is it's important to separate that from what the evidence has to say. Does a declining minimum wage, real minimum wage, per se, on its own, imply that we should raise it? So this is a quote from, I didn't put a date on it, but you'll figure it out. Since it was first established in 1938, the minimum wage was eroded substantially over several prolonged periods because of inflation. The proposal to raise the minimum wage by $1.75 by the end of 2015 would restore the real value of the minimum wage to what it was in 1981. So this was the argument made quite frequently under the Obama administration. At first was talking about $10, but I guess in this statement was actually talking about $9, even less aggressive. But the argument is sort of, if you read it, it's simply, the real minimum wage has declined, therefore we should raise it. Well, it's actually a little more complicated than that, because the minimum wage isn't the only policy we use to try to provide a floor for income. It's one, right? The minimum wage law says, of course, is you cannot pay a worker less than this amount per hour. So it doesn't determine the income floor, because you got to have a job and you got to have hours, but obviously it has something to do with it. But we also have something called the EITC, or the Earned Income Tax Credit, which I won't define now, but I'll get back to it later. But all you need to know for now is it's a policy that subsidizes income for families with low income. So what I show you here, the yellow line is the exact same minimum wage line I showed you from before. The real decline, certainly from the early part of the sample to the late. The orange line is, what I'm doing here is, the yellow line looks the same, but I've rescaled it into what you would make at the minimum wage if you work full time, 2,080 hours a year, okay? The orange line is what you would make including the EITC for a family of one adult, two children, which is the families that are most directly targeted by the EITC. So think poor female-headed households or low-income female-headed households. So the EITC, you can see by the orange line sort of separating from the yellow line, has become a very generous way by which we subsidize family incomes and make sure families don't have low incomes. And in a sense, the real value of the income floor, the tool we now use to maintain an income floor, has actually gotten more generous, right? So I look at this graph. I actually wrote this for a New York Times, whatever that economics blog with an X, I don't know why, a couple years ago, to make the point that we had a minimum wage, we still have a minimum wage, but then we sort of invented this thing called the EITC in the 1970s, and it's gotten more and more generous, and lots of countries have copied it. And most economists and most policymakers apparently think it's a better tool. A better tool to provide a minimum level of income for families. And if in fact that's right, there's not, the fact that we've let the other one wither a bit to become less important in real terms may be a perfectly sensible thing to do. So it doesn't make sense to talk about the declining real minimum wage in isolation without taking account of the other things we do to provide an income floor, and in fact, we've gotten more generous on that score. So the third contention that of the ones I'm going to go through quickly, was that a minimum wage will counter the rise in inequality. So here's the same graph I showed you before. Remember, this is the ratio of median to 10th percentile earnings. Okay? This is actually the same graph, except I changed the scale. So the 2 is now way down at the bottom. Now you might wonder, why did I do this? Anyone know why I did that? Well, so I could show you what happened at the top and on the same graph. Okay? That's the 90-10 differential. So that's the ratio between people at the 90th percentile over people at the 10th percentile. Now the 90th percentile is certainly upper middle class, but not the super rich, right? Not even close, perhaps not even the rich. The point is that a lot of the action in terms of inequality has come at the top. Some of you were here for Emmanuel Sias's lecture a couple years ago, who talked a lot about that. And if I showed you this graph for the 99th percentile versus the 10th, or the 99.9th percentile versus the 10th, which Sias can do because he has tax returns, it would go through the ceiling, right? It just gets, it's more, what's happened at the top is where the real extreme growth in inequality is, which is interesting in the context of minimum wages, because minimum wages isn't going to do anything at the top of the wage distribution, and nothing direct anyways, right? No first order effects. So the rise in inequality that most people are talking about has nothing to do with the low end and nothing to do with minimum wages. It might help at the bottom, I'm not saying it won't. But when people talk about the overall rise in inequality in America, it's not something that's really amenable to fixing or even making much of a detectable dent in it at all with the minimum wage, because it's much more an upper tail problem than a lower tail problem. Now that has to happen to some extent because income can go up indefinitely and it can only fall to zero. So in some sense, you're always going to get bunching at the bottom, not the top. But it's worth seeing what these facts look like. Okay, so those are kind of the three sort of contentions I talked about before. I don't know if low minimum wage is immoral or not. I don't know if inequality is immoral or not, and you shouldn't perhaps care what I think about that, but understand when people are making a moral argument. Second is it may not do that much for inequality because it's not really going on there, the action. And the third is that although the real minimum wage has declined, that's not the whole story, because we now actually have another very generous program that those of us who pay taxes, which is everyone in this room, pays for, to ensure that families have whatever we have deemed a minimally acceptable standard of living. So now I want to turn to the two sort of key assertions that the research really gets at. So the first is a higher minimum wage will help low-wage workers, first step. And the second is a higher minimum wage will reduce poverty. Now, why do I'm not going to pretend that all the economists agree on the answers to these questions. There's probably more agreement on the second than the first, I think. But I think almost every economist would agree that if a higher minimum wage doesn't help low-wage workers, and if a higher minimum wage doesn't reduce poverty, it's not the right poverty tool. It's very hard to make an argument for a minimum wage absent those one or both of these things being true. I used to imagine if I could convince Ted Kennedy that my results were right, he would give it up, but then he died. So, okay. So how does the minimum wage affect low-wage workers? I hope you can see what it says there. If we raise the minimum wage to $1 million, everyone will be Bill Gates, which is often how the debate sometimes reads. What do economists have to say about that? Well, economic theory tells us that when things become more expensive, in most cases, there are exceptions, we use less of them. We've seen this for gasoline. Those of you remember the 2008 election when gasoline prices spiked and we had a huge growth in Prius sales and all these kinds of things. We tax cigarettes, and the evidence says for those who are sensitive, young people, the ones they actually want to discourage from smoking, they actually respond to those taxes and smoke less. Reversing it, we subsidize things we want people to do, which of course is making it cheaper, so they consume more of it, and green technology is one example of that. So clearly, at first order, when you think about the minimum wage, you got to worry about this. Or if I make low-skilled labor more expensive, firms may find ways to use less of it. It seems a natural thing to worry about, what economists always call an unintended consequence, which we're always fond of pointing out. We want a $15 minimum wage, and the guy behind the counter says, you want layoffs with that. I couldn't believe there were this many minimum wage cartoons, actually, when I really went looking for them. Kind of amazing. I think a lot of them are the same person. Labor's a little more complicated than just gasoline prices or something like that. So here's sort of 3 weeks of labor demand theory boiled down to one lecture. What happens in the labor market? What do we think happens in the standard model, at least? Well, minimum wage goes up. It makes low-skilled labor more expensive, right, relative to other kinds of labor. Firms then economize on the use of low-skilled labor and switch to using other inputs. Might be capital, might be high-skilled, substituting three low-skilled workers for 2 high-skilled workers. But one way or another, they substitute away from low-skilled labor and towards other inputs. That necessarily raises their costs, because otherwise they would have used that combination of inputs before if it actually wasn't more expensive. That's going to raise prices. Assuming consumers are sensitive to price, it's going to reduce demand. So you have 2 channels by which low-skilled workers might suffer the consequences. One is that first substitution away from them towards higher-skilled workers or machines. And the second is, and that's what we call it the substitution effect. The second is if prices of sort of the things that minimum wage workers produce go up, there's a scale effect. Firms just will be able to sell less of that stuff, and they'll use fewer low-wage workers because of that. High-wage workers, it's ambiguous, right? They might use more of them, we might use less of them, depending on which of those two effects is bigger. But that's basically the neoclassical theory of labor demand, which is the basis of the prediction that a higher minimum wage will reduce employment of the least skilled workers. And what I mean by that, and we can't always see this very well in the data, but it's the people whose wages would have been pushed up by the minimum wage. Okay. Is the theory right? So this is the big debate, and it's been going on forever. Not forever. In our book, my book with Bill Washer, we actually talk about papers written on this topic before 1920 in Australia and places like that where they first raised minimum wages. So this is my view of the evidence, but I think I will give you a balanced view, fairly balanced anyways. So there used to be what we call time series studies. We used to not have the data we have now. So we would observe over time the employment rate of teenagers, let's say, or 16 to 24-year-olds, a low-skilled group. We would observe what happened to the minimum wage over time, and we would observe other things over time, like the growth of the economy or the unemployment rate for higher-skilled people, whatever it might be. In those studies, pretty uniformly, not surprisingly, because it was the same data used in each study, just with another couple years of data, said that the minimum wage elasticity was about -0.1 to -0.2. What is that number? It's a useful number to understand because reporters cite it all the time, because that's the way we all tend to summarize our evidence. So the elasticity is the percent change in employment divided by the percent change in the minimum wage. I'll talk later about whether that's actually a sensible measure. That's about -0.1 to -0.2. So if I raise the minimum wage by 10%, these estimates say employment of, not total employment, but of low-skilled workers, some subset of affected workers will fall by 1 to 2%. It's a little tricky because when you do studies that really zoom in on the people whose wages were directly pushed up or would have been, because they used to get paid below the minimum, you get some much bigger elasticities. Jake Vigder talked about the Seattle minimum wage here a while back. His elasticities are closer to implied elasticities are close to -1. And I'll talk a bit about why there's that ambiguity. The problem is, though, that those time series studies are not entirely convincing. We have what we call in empirical work, evaluating the effects of policies, the problem of the counterfactual. We're always trying, think what we're trying to do here. The policy changes somewhere, right, in the older data, just at the national level, because there were no state minimum wages. And we see, after the policy changes, what teen employment is and how much it changed. But what we don't know is what would have happened if the minimum wage had not gone up, because we don't have an observation on the economy without that having happened. Okay? So in the time series data, all you can do is sort of get that out of a statistical model. A good example of that is we had this big fiscal stimulus, the ARRA, in response to the Great Recession. We then observed what happened to the aggregate economy after that, and people arguing about whether or not it had an impact face the same problem, because what would have happened had we not done it? We have no observation on that. All we can do is sort of build a counterfactual, in that case often based very much on models. With minimum wages, we sort of started to get better evidence, and this is actually how I got into this literature. It's a funny story. When I had my first day of graduate labor economics in 1984, I think it was, A professor came in, and the lecture was, what do people who study labor economics do, right? What are you getting into? And at that time, there was a couple years after there had been this massive project run by the Department of Labor to commission a ton of papers on minimum wages. And pretty much every labor economist you've ever heard of, probably 10 years older than me, has a paper in that book. It was like, for those of you who know what this means, the New York City phone books. There was like it was 5 volumes actually, this thick. And he said, whatever you do, don't study minimum wages, right? We know everything there is to know. And then I was at the Fed. My first job was at the Fed. And at the Fed, we used to, I was a labor economist. There were 4 of us among like 200 economists. But every day, this is was not pre-internet, but very sophisticated internet, we'd get this report from, called the Daily Labor Report, which was any change, any reporting of, a government statistic came out, or any kind of change in any law in any state. And we started to see in the late 80s that a bunch of states started to raise their minimum wages. And we and some other people at the same time had the idea this might be a more useful way to study the effects of minimum wages than these time series studies. Why? Because now I could think about 2 states kind of maybe hit by the same business cycle because they're in the same country or maybe in the same region. Minimum wage goes up in one and not the other. And now I have something that is arguably closer to an observable counterfactual. I can approximate with the state where the minimum wage didn't go up what would have happened in the state where it did go up, and then estimate the difference. And that's a method we use in increasingly sophisticated terms, all over the place in economics. I have this line about the UK here, which is relevant because most other countries just have national minimum wages, right? Canada has regional minimum wages. They have 11 provinces. There are some regional minimum wages in a few other places. Most countries only have national minimum wages, so they're still kind of stuck with this difficulty of estimating minimum wage effects. But the US, we have this, what I call this great economics laboratory. And it's not just true for minimum wages, it's true for all kinds of policies, right? States can do whatever they want, subject to some constraints. You can't have a minimum wage lower than the federal minimum wage for the workers covered by the federal minimum wage, which now, originally wasn't that many people, but now is effectively everybody. But you can always go higher, right? Just like a lot of laws. States can't get out of the federal law, but they can have stronger laws in some cases if they want to. So what you see here is what I talked about before, that we started to have this growth in state minimum wages. Down to the left, there's virtually no states with a higher minimum wage. Connecticut had a constitutional provision that its minimum wage had to be 0.5% higher than the federal minimum wage, which I always thought was a little odd, but somebody thought they were making a point. I think Alaska was always a little higher, but probably not as important there. But then you can see it just takes off. There's some spikes, and the spike down is when the federal minimum wage goes up. Then, of course, it catches up to some states, so it looks like there's fewer states with a higher minimum. But the trend is up. That's the number. That's the percentage difference. So some of these differences are pretty big and getting even bigger. So for labor economists, that's a godsend, at least, if not for low-wage workers. What does the evidence say? So I've done a bunch of papers on this, as have other people. In 2007, my co-author from the Fed, from that original collaboration, and I thought we'd write a brief review of what these studies said, not realizing we were going to find about 120 studies in English, let alone the ones we couldn't read in other languages. And it ended up being about a 150-page paper. But it went through all the evidence since kind of the early 90s when you first had the state minimum wages you could work through, what is sometimes called the so-called new minimum wage research. So we reviewed these studies. About 2/3 of them find negative effects. We make our own assessment as to which ones are most credible. Other people can disagree, but when we do that, about 85% of them find negative effects. And when the study zoomed in more accurately, as best we could tell, on lower skilled workers, maybe because they had prior wage information, maybe because of the skill definitions they use, high school dropouts, whatever it might be, the negative effects were bigger, right? Which is kind of what you'd expect if minimum wages reduce employment of least skilled workers. There's the famous New Jersey, Pennsylvania study by David Card and Alan Kruger, which I don't like to talk about that much because it's kind of old, but it comes up all the time. They actually found, it often gets cited as evidence that minimum wages don't reduce employment. This study actually showed a huge positive effect of minimum wages on employment, which the authors sort of tried to not emphasize in the paper. Remember I said the elasticity was -0.1 to -0.2? They're kind of 0.8. So you raise the minimum wage by 10%, employment at fast food restaurants goes up by around 8%, which is puzzling. We did some subsequent work on that and showed that it was a very mundane problem of data collection. They surveyed restaurants. this is a good lesson for graduate students if you ever do your own survey. They surveyed restaurants, and they said, we want to talk to manager and assistant manager, and they did this 9 months apart, before and after. One state raised its minimum wage and the other one didn't. And the survey question was, this is a quote, how many people work in your store, right? Which you can imagine the response would be anything from, oh, let me see, there's 5 people here, to, oh, I just did the payroll, and I'm on the New Jersey Turnpike, so we're open 24 hours a day, and 80 people work in my store. There's 80 people on the payroll. And the reason you know it's a problem is because you come back to these stores 9 months later, and you have employment swings of sometimes 20, 30, 40 employees. And we've been in fast food restaurants, right? They're kind of always staffed by roughly the same number of people, except, for some shift variation. So it was clear something weird was going on. So we got actually the payroll data from the employers. They sent us their ADP things on the computer paper we used to have, with the holes down the side, and didn't seem to be the right answer for that paper. There's a whole bunch of other studies that have come out in the last, starting in 2010 and continuing to today, and there'll probably be one tomorrow when I open my email, which argue that you can't just use the state approach. Just saying states where the minimum wage didn't go up, give you an idea of what the minimum wage would have done elsewhere is not enough. They say you've got to use geographically really close areas, counties across the border, states that border each other, states in the same census region, whatever it might be. It is the case that when you do that, when you use that approach, you tend not to find disemployment effects of minimum wages. You tend to find estimates near zero. There's this curious thing, which I'm not going to tell you what these tables say, and you probably can't read them, but I'm actually going to flip to the second one and just make the point. So these are the studies that use the close controls approach, right? Cross-border counties, wherever it might be. And with the one exception in the darker color down below, they tend to always find no effects. And then there's a bunch of other recent studies which are dealing with the same empirical problem that other literature addresses, which is that maybe minimum wages are chosen in relation to economic conditions that can make the kind of state comparisons invalid. So these other approaches do a lot of different things to try to deal with that problem. And they tend to all find negative effects. So there's kind of 3 or 4 new approaches that find negative effects, one that doesn't. It's kind of a technical issue as to what's going on. I have some recent work which tries to argue why I think these are more valid, but there's definitely an open question in literature as to why these different approaches give different estimates. In fact, he's not here, it's Kyle. No, I was at an advancement exam today where a student actually was doing some technical econometric questions to try to resolve these differences between these different approaches. So it's a pretty active area of research. So how would I summarize that? The conclusion is contested, right? But that doesn't mean we don't know the answer. That's kind of my take on this, right? Some earlier papers and some recent papers don't find negative effects of the minimum wage on employment. It's a minority of studies, for sure. It hinges on restrictions on the data and on the approach that I don't think can be supported, and there's some evidence against them. I think there's a continued flow of studies that find negative effects with a lot of different research designs. So that's sort of my take. You have to pick and choose your own evidence. What I want to caution you against, though, as a sort of trying to be an intelligent consumer of what you read about this stuff, is when someone says there's no evidence that minimum wage reduce employment, that's simply not true, right? If they want to say, here's a quote from Paul Krugman a couple years ago in the New York Times, and about 15 years ago he said the best minimum wage was zero. Now says there's no evidence that raising the minimum wage costs jobs, at least when the starting point is as low as it is in modern America. That's simply not true, right? There is evidence. If you wanted to say, I believe these studies and not those studies, we can argue. But you will see that assertion made frequently in the debate, that we know minimum wages don't reduce employment. And why does it happen exactly? I don't know. This is a highly, highly politicized debate, and there are researchers in this debate, probably on both sides. I think the pro side is a little more guilty of this, who adhere to a position and read evidence very selectively, in my view. So anyways, that's my take on that. So there's a second line of defense, though, which is, well, okay, minimum wages reduce employment a little bit, and some of these folks take that position. But the elasticity is so low, right, that workers must be helped. So here's the basic argument they're making. Let's suppose we take an elasticity of minus 0.2. Remember, that's the percent change in low-skilled employment divided by the percent change in the minimum wage. So now you sort of do this calculation. We raise the minimum wage by 10%, let's say. 2% of low-wage workers lose their jobs. 98% of them, the ones who didn't lose their jobs, get a raise, right? Sounds like a lot more winners than losers. And the average income of low-wage workers goes up, and there I do, there's just the gains plus the losses, 98% times the 10% raise, 2% times the 100% loss if you lose your job, simplification. And so that 10% increase in the minimum wage raises the income of low-wage workers by almost 8%, okay? Another way of saying that is that the elasticity of income with respect to the minimum wage is a lot smaller than -1 in absolute value, right? Income is not very, doesn't decline much when the minimum wage goes up. That's a really bad calculation, as it turns out. This is not a great graph, I apologize, but let me give you a different example to make the point, and those, if you want to stare at the graph, can stare at the graph, whatever you call that slide. If I said what happens to the demand for apples when I raise the price of Macintosh apples, the answer might be not very much, right? Because there's a lot of different kinds of apples, right? Whereas if you ask what happens to the price of Macintosh apples when you raise the price, what happens to did I say the price? What happens to the quantity of Macintosh apples sold when you raise the price of Macintosh apples? It may fall a lot. And that's one of the problems with the minimum wage literature. So most studies are doing things like looking at teenagers, right? Why teenagers? Because I'll talk about this later, they're a huge share of minimum wage workers. But they're not all at the minimum wage. In fact, many teenagers earn above the minimum wage. So we raise the minimum wage by 10%, we see minimum employment of teenagers fall by 2%. What we really care about is the employment decline among those who would have gotten the minimum wage increase. If I was a teenager making $20 an hour already, I'm not the one who's losing my job, right? Whereas the one who was making minimum wage was. So you want to actually kind of compare the minimum wage increase for those who get it to the employment loss among those who get it. And this figure is a way of illustrating that essentially when you do it that way, you can easily show that even an elasticity minus 0.2 can imply that income actually doesn't change or even falls for the lowest wage workers, okay? And there are actually two studies that show that. One is the Seattle study I mentioned by Jake Vigdor that he talked about. And Jeff Clemens at UCSD has a paper where he very cleverly focuses on very low wage workers based on what they were earning prior to the minimum wage. And you look at what happened to their employment when the minimum wage went up, and that elasticity is actually close to -1, which means essentially it's a wash, right? Some are helped, some are hurt, but there's no average change in income aside, which is different from what you conclude from this. So this notion that the elasticity is pretty small, so workers must gain isn't really legitimate. And recent studies, and they're only recent ones, that really try to dig into that by trying to isolate much better just the affected workers, find that the employment losses lead to roughly offsetting effects on income, so that on average income of affected workers, I think first blush, is unaffected by minimum wages. So does the minimum wage help low wage workers? That's what we were starting with. I got a raise, I got a wage, my boss fired me to pay for their raise. And the answer is, yeah, some, right? But there's costs, right? There are winners and losers from a higher minimum wage. I think that's what most of the evidence says, and you really can't get around it. Which doesn't tell you what to do, should we raise it or not, it just tells you it's more complicated than this is just good for everybody, okay? I just want to say a couple words before going on to the poverty question about what a $15 minimum wage might mean. Right, so the federal minimum wage was set at 7.25. A couple cities are at 15, a couple are getting close, and a couple states are getting close to that at a slower rate. California we'll get there in a while, New York a little bit later. I get asked, what's it going to do? And the right answer is I have no idea, because we don't have data on minimum wage increases anywhere near this big, right? I can tell you what past increases have done with 50 cents, 75 cents, with the Seattle minimum wage, maybe $1 or $2. But if you want to tell me what's going to happen in Mississippi, if we go from the federal minimum wage, where which is what mine's are, 7.25 to 15, I don't know. But I do know one thing, that it's going to affect a lot of workers. I did a calculation for California, which of course has high wage areas and low wage areas, but even some of the inland counties, a $15 minimum wage, when I did the calculation kind of, inflating the year it would get there and inflating current wages up to that level, you get 45% of workers are affected by the minimum wage, whereas the federal minimum wage hits something like 5 to 10% of workers. So it's a huge increase in the share of workers who are affected, and that raises a number of concerns. First of all, when not many workers are covered and you raise the minimum wage, companies have a lot of ways to respond aside from laying off workers, right? You can let the bathrooms get a little dirtier. There's a study by a couple Harvard Business School economists who show that Yelp ratings of restaurants decline when the minimum wage goes up, suggesting that they're somehow reducing their service, and some close as well. You can cut benefits a little bit. those who've been following the Amazon story have seen not cutting benefits, but cutting other components of pay. You can do a little substitution towards other kind of workers or capital or whatever it might be. But obviously, as you raise it more and it affects more and more workers, your hands are tied more in terms of what you can do. There aren't that many ways to get around a doubling of the minimum wage for 40% of your workforce. The second is, and I'll come back to this later, the extent to which minimum wages go to poor workers, that is workers in poor families, declines the higher the minimum wage goes up. The third is, in all of this discussion, I never see people talking about what's going to happen to the high school dropouts, what's going to happen to the minorities, what's going to happen to the lowest wage workers in the economy when this happens. Because if anyone's going to get hurt, it's going to be them. And the fourth concern is that most of these minimum wage proposals, and indeed some of the cities and states that have raised the minimum wage recently, now index them to inflation. We saw before the federal minimum wage is not indexed, which is why it plummets when there's some inflation. Indexation kind of makes sense. If you're going to have a minimum wage, why not preserve its real value? But it does mean that from the firm's perspective, the minimum wage increase is much more permanent, right? If the minimum wage goes up sort of one shot in an environment with little inflation, companies might say, well, no big deal. It'll get inflated away over time. We don't need to make big adjustments. We're not going to sort of change our physical capital to deal with this. If your minimum wage goes up and now it's indexed, now you've had a permanent relative increase in the cost of low-wage labor, and that can have much more lasting effects. So I worry about a $50 minimum wage, although I don't really know what will happen. So this is sort of turning the tables a little bit. I'm convinced minimum wages reduce employment, but that doesn't mean the minimum wage isn't a good idea, right? It just says the minimum wage costs some people some jobs. I would challenge you to come up with a government regulation, you probably come up with one or two, that isn't going to cost somebody a job somewhere, right? If we ever deal with climate change, oil refinery workers are not going to be happy, right? They're going to lose their jobs. It's the job of policymakers to make sort of the tough call, right? There are some gains, there are some losses. Is it worth it? What are we going to do? So I think what you want to ask is not just is there job loss from the minimum wage, and this is sort of the California business lobby always has their top 10 job killers, I think, every year. And they always say, you know, minimum wage reduces employment. We know that, therefore it's a terrible idea. But they never say, what are the benefits, right? So what are the potential benefits, at least? Well, Ted Kennedy, quoted in a actually very good biography of him, said the minimum wage was one of the first and is still one of the best anti-poverty programs we have. Obama, somewhat later. Nobody who works full-time should have to live in poverty. That's a slightly more subtle point, but clearly the minimum wage is viewed as a way to reduce poverty. And if you follow the current debate, that's what comes up again and again and again. So I would argue that's a reasonable way to evaluate the minimum wage. Does it actually reduce poverty? If there is some reduction in poverty, what's the magnitude? And then we sort of face this trade-off, right? Maybe there's some job loss, but maybe we reduce the number of poor families, and that's a good thing. So this little table shows you information on the distribution of the benefits of the minimum wage. So the left-hand column you see says income to needs. That's the ratio of a family's income to the poverty line. That's what we call income to needs. So if it's 1, your income is exactly equal to the poverty line. And the poverty line does depend on how many kids are in your family, how many people in your family. And then 1 to 1 1/4, 1 1/4 to 1 1/2, I go up to 3 or above. So what this chart says is that it shows that what I do here is I choose a definition of low-wage workers. We think about a minimum wage increase. I forget exactly what increase I was doing here, but I think it was the $10 Obama minimum wage proposal. 85% of benefits would go to poor families, right? Families below the poverty line. That looks like terrific targeting of the minimum wage to poor families. The only problem is that's from 1939, okay? And if you expand that, it changes dramatically. So compare that left-hand column where 85% of the benefits went to poor families to the right-hand column, 2012, 12% of the benefits go to poor families, okay? Look at highlight that in yellow here. Why do so few of the benefits of a higher minimum wage go to poor families? Well, there's a few reasons, but the principal reason is that if you look at families, leaving out the retirement age population, household heads 18 to 64, more than half of poor families have 0 workers, right? Now, why is that different in 2012 than in 1939? Well, because you don't starve to death, right, if you don't have income in 2012, right? We have government benefits, we have protections for people. So it didn't really used to be possible to live without working. Of course, this also may have something to do with the minimum wage, right? Pricing those people out of the labor market. And then if you look at, highlight the number at the bottom, 40% of the benefits and this is a very simple calculation, which I haven't explained, but basically what I'm doing here is you raise the minimum wage, top everyone up to it if they're below it, and there's no behavioral responses. There's no job loss or anything like that here. So you have this increase in the wage bill, and then you assign it to the workers based on the income level of their family, and you say what share goes to which part of the income distribution. 40% of the benefits go to families 3 times the poverty line, which is about median income. Okay, so what that means, let's think roughly 40% of the benefits, we can quibble a little about the numbers, but roughly 40% of the benefits go to roughly the top half of the family income distribution, which is a pretty stunning number, I think. This is my, when I had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, this is the cartoon they drew. I had no say in the cartoon. Obama was throwing money, $10, I guess it was 10 minimum wages, and they have none of it going to poor families because it's the Wall Street Journal. That's not quite accurate. Some of it goes to poor families, but the point is a lot of it goes to non-poor families. Why does it happen? Some people hear me say that and say, well, how is that possible, right? How can you raise wages for low-wage workers and most of it doesn't go to poor families? Well, the reason is simply that being a low-wage worker and being in a poor family are simply not the same thing. They're related, right? If I tell you someone's a low-wage worker, they're more likely to be in a low-income family than a high-income family, but they're very weakly related. And the reason they're weakly related is one reason I told you already is that a lot of poor families have 0 workers, right? The other reason is, and this also explains why those numbers change as you move across that chart, is there's a lot more secondary and tertiary workers. A lot of teens work. Teenagers are about 25% of workers near the federal minimum, and people aged 16 to 24 are around 50%. And those people aren't particularly poor. You should never use an anecdote for evidence, but I will. I live in San Francisco, and my daughter was in high school when San Francisco first raised the minimum wage, I think in 06 or 07 or somewhere around there. And she had a job working in a little gymnastics school out in the Sunset District, and she came home, and she said, I'm so excited they're raising the minimum wage. And I said, Noe, I bet I make 3 times what your employer makes, right? And she was getting the higher minimum wage. And the point is that you have a lot of teenagers who have after-school jobs and the like, who are not in poor families. There's no reason in the world we want to redistribute income towards them. In fact, we might want to do the opposite. We want them to not work and work harder in school. I would predict that in California, as the minimum wage climbs to 15, you're going to have a lot of upper middle class kids taking jobs after school, because that's real money, and probably displacing some of the kids who've already dropped out of high school and really need those jobs, but we will see. Those calculations, like I showed you, simple as they may be, suggest that to get $1 to a minimum wage family, you've got to raise the wage bill for the minimum wage bill by around $5, right? Which is a very inefficient tax and transfer scheme, if you want to call it that. Those are all simulations. What does the research show? There's a big literature on this too, not nearly as big as the employment literature. Most of it shows no net effect of minimum wages on poverty. Again, kind of a wash. The estimates are probably in the direction of reducing poverty. Almost impossible to find a statistically significant effect, though, in a lot of different studies. So the implication is, like with earnings and workers, when we look at families, there are winners and there are losers. Some poor families gain, some poor or near poor families lose, and the net effect is hard to find anything except a wash. There's some other effects. The incidence of price increases probably disadvantages the poor. Our last lecture was Kevin Murphy in the spring. Kevin and I were at a panel at the American Enterprise Institute a long time ago. And Kevin's, those of you who are there, he's a great speaker. And we were talking about minimum wages, and he said, I never forget this, he said, he forgot it, I actually asked him if he remembered, but he doesn't. But he walked into the panel, and Kevin's a very casual guy, and he says, you know, I was just eating lunch at the Kentucky Fried Chicken, and I didn't know on which side of the counter people were poor, right? Point being, the people who tend to consume the product of minimum wage workers tend to be low-income workers, right? They consume more fast food, more cheap products, fewer yachts. Yachts, I'm pretty sure, are not built by minimum wage workers. I'm pretty sure Teslas are not built by minimum wage workers. So the price increases are probably somewhat regressive. We don't have great information on that, but it's probably true to some extent. What about the argument, which we've heard lately, and this actually came up with the whatever Bernie Sanders bill with a cute acronym was about Amazon, the Bezos Act, I forget what it stands for. I know who Bezos is. The claim that we are sort of we're subsidizing employers by paying for these social programs. Let's instead make companies pay higher wages, and then we'll spend less on these programs, right? So we'll sort of shift the responsibility to them. Well, you actually don't see that in the data. A recent pretty comprehensive study of Medicaid, free reduced price lunch, public housing, TANF, that's welfare, SNAP, that we call food stamps, and WIC, which is a family for a program for for babies, shows that when the minimum wage goes up, you don't get reduction in spending on those programs. And again, it's probably because you've got some people who earn a little more money and therefore consume somewhat less from those government programs. Some people lose their jobs and take more from those government programs, and there's kind of a wash. The only program that falls is SNAP. So food stamp spending declines when the minimum wage goes up, which some people have jumped on and say, aha, see, but food stamps are a funny program. Food stamps require workers searching for work since 1996, since welfare reform, right? So if it's harder to find a job, you actually might lose your food stamp benefits, right? So food stamps falling does not necessarily mean that people are earning more and therefore don't need it as much anymore. It's a tricky program. It's the only one that works that way, where you can actually get more benefits from, well, the EITC does, but that's not in here. You can get more benefits from the program by working more. Okay, so last section of my lecture, quickly, is it as hopeless as it seems? Because so far this has been pretty hopeless and a little discouraging. And it's important because, as we saw, changes in the economy have disadvantaged less skilled workers. It's a lot worse to be a low skilled worker now, certainly in relative terms and almost surely in absolute terms as well, than it was 20 or 30 years ago. So we have the central challenge. Is there something we can do to increase incomes of low skilled workers, or even more importantly, low income families, without discouraging work? That's the dilemma we face. We've been talking about the minimum wage, and the problem with the minimum wage is it certainly helps some workers, but it does reduce hiring. The alternative is we could provide income support. We do that through the welfare system. Not so much anymore, those of you who are at Bob Moffitt's lecture. There's a lot of talk about universal basic income, right? Sort of an income guarantee for everybody, possibly phasing out, possibly not. Jesse Rothstein gave a lecture about that. Those programs always sort of put us in the classical public finance sort of dilemma. As long as we're not willing, as long as we want, we as a society, and all rich societies do this, say there's going to be some minimum standard of living we want to guarantee. We want to get those benefits to the people who need them, but some people change the behavior because of those programs. And how many and how much and to what extent are we discouraging work? Pretty clear evidence that welfare discourage work on some part of the population, which doesn't mean it's a bad program. It just means we have to realize that's part of the problem. And universal basic income, probably even more. We don't know. I would say, none of that's to say those are not good programs, and obviously some of the people who get those benefits wouldn't be working anyways, and we need to take care of those people. But I would say certainly in this current political environment, if we can do anything, and the answer may be we can't, but if we can do anything, probably likely to get buy-in from both sides on programs that at least have the promise of encouraging work, of raising incomes for low-income families while encouraging work at the same time. And the Earned Income Tax Credit does that. Now, what does the Earned Income Tax Credit do? If you don't work, it pays nothing. So Bob Moffitt was here. He used this ironic phrase, I'm not sure it was trying to be ironic, the work-based safety net. Now, the safety net is usually a phrase for how we take care of people who can't make any money, right? And the point is, we now have a system which, for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part pays benefits to people, props up your income, but you got to work to get it. Not really, we're a lot stingier to people who don't work at all and a lot more generous to the people who work but have low incomes. And that's what the Earned Income Tax Credit does. If you don't work at all, you get nothing from it. But if you work, it subsidizes your earnings at a very generous percentage, up to 40, with 3 kids, up to 45% of your income, up to somewhere in the high $17,000, $18,000. In theory, more people should work in response, and they do. That's one of the clearest findings in labor economics, that certainly single mothers with kids, well, single mothers, they have kids because they're mothers, have a strong employment response to the EITC. The other brilliant thing I think about the EITC is it's based on family income, right? It doesn't have this problem that the minimum wage does, that it goes to low-wage workers. It explicitly goes to low-income families because it's done through the tax system. They know how much families are making, right? And it's also simple to administer because of that. So the EITC is very effective. And finally, we know from the research 2 things. One, not magic at all. If you take account of the EITC payment, it reduces poverty. That's not surprising. If we give people money, we can reduce poverty. Right? Nothing magic there. The sort of magic pixie dust part of the EITC, though, is that the evidence says, and multiple papers, that when you make the EITC more generous, more families earn their way out of poverty before you even count the EITC check. So you're creating a work incentive program that, even before you get the benefit, reduces poverty, increases the fraction of people who earn their way out of poverty. And that's a pretty strong selling point. What's a better policy? Well, I'd say a couple things about this. This depends to some extent on if you think the government has any role in redistribution, right? But as long as you take the view that, yeah, it's our responsibility to guarantee some level of income at the bottom. How do we compare these two policies? The minimum wage, in my view, doesn't target the poor well. That's actually a fact. We know that. It almost surely doesn't redistribute money from the rich, right? I mean, I'm not sure who pays the minimum wage. I'm actually doing a project now with tax data in Israel, because we can actually see every worker in every firm as well as the owner's tax return, which is really cool. So I'll get some evidence on this question for another country. We don't really know this in the US, but I'm pretty sure it's the people who own the laundromats who are paying for the minimum wage, not the people who work for Goldman Sachs. And the people who work for Goldman Sachs are making a lot more money. The EITC, or anything else we do through taxing and spending, we can target the poor much more effectively. The EITC does that very well. It's financed by taxes, right? So we can at least engage in the kind of, if we're going to redistribute, we probably want those who can pay the most to pay for it. And the EITC does that. Universal basic income has that same advantage relative to a minimum wage, which is why it may be a better policy than the minimum wage. More likely to discourage work, I think, although there's some evidence emerging on it, which raises some questions about whether the extent to which that's true, and we don't really know. So what are the lessons? The minimum wage has some negative consequences, which is not a statement that it's a bad policy, that I'm against it, just that it has some negative consequences. Hard to find net benefits for low-income families. Alternative policy, the ITC seems to work better, encouraging work and raising income for low-income families. Some of the work I'm doing with ESPRI, that's kind of work in progress, with Brittany, she's here, and the other folks are not here, tries to get at the longer term effects of these policies. And the idea is, if the minimum wage shuts young people out of the labor market, it may diminish skill formation, because they don't gain labor market experience. Whereas the EITC encourages work, people may gain skills and have earnings growth over time. And I have one paper that finds quite strong evidence that the long-term effects of the EITC for women are to raise earnings pretty dramatically, which is sort of a kind of a multiplier effect of the policy. So where do I finish? Well, it's complicated. You can see the three people here. $12 for a crappy little hamburger, that's the price effect. Look on the bright side, now I'm getting $15 an hour, and the third guy got laid off. I think that's the most important lesson. It's complicated. I don't mean to argue there's only one position one can take, but if you think it's not complicated, that's the wrong position. There's winners and losers. There's not just winners, as the advocates would have us believe. There's not just losers, as some of the critics of minimum wages would have us believe. Research can help us kind of figure out who the winners and losers are and how much they gain and lose. That's what empirical research is all about. And then policymakers have to decide if enough of the gains are going to those they want to help to offset the losses for others. My current take on this is I haven't been convinced that the benefits outweigh the costs. That's my own view, but at least I hope this gives you some appreciation of the issues and what the trade-offs are you have to think about, and how you want to evaluate what people are saying and what you're reading when you hear, as you will more, about minimum wages. Good. Thanks. You want to moderate?
Thanks, David. We have a few minutes for questions. I want to ask David the first question, because I've had a few been at a couple of these lectures.
It's warm.
I never see anybody debating the earned income tax credit. All the things I read, is there anyone talking about that as
a negative?
Well, no, as a policy. I don't see anyone talking about it as a policy. I hear minimum wage every day, but I don't hear anyone talking about, is there ways to improve that?
Oh, so if I showed you the graph on state EITCs, it would look like the minimum wage. A lot of states, there's now about 25 states that supplement the federal EITC, and some pretty generously. California has the most generous. California, late to the game in 2016, they actually have an 80% subsidy to the federal minimum wage. So they almost double what the federal government pays you. They did it in a really crazy way. They did 80% up to your first about $7,000. And then the EITC always phases out, because they don't want people who make a lot to get it. So usually the federal phase out is kind of slow. So people up in the $40,000 range are still getting a little bit. California phased it out at the 80% rate, so the budget constraint went like that and like that. I testified in the legislature to a representative who was trying to change that, and I asked her why, and she said, my constituents are telling me they can't get anybody to work more than part-time. which is exactly what you'd expect from this kind of budget constraint, right? It made a huge kink. But no, states are doing this for sure. It hasn't come up at the federal level. Well, I mean, the federal level, the one thing that has come up, Obama pushed this pretty hard, was the way the ITC is structured is you get essentially nothing, not quite true, a little bit if you have no kids. One kid, it's a 34% subsidy, two, it's 40, and three, it's 45. There's been talk about increasing it substantially for people without kids. And the reason we don't do that is because we kind of focus anti-poverty policy on kids, because in this country, some people still think adults are responsible for being poor, but no one thinks a 5-year-old decided to be poor, which is a reasonable point of view, obviously. But the counter argument is you look at low marriage rates and all in disadvantaged communities, and having a more generous EITC for people without kids. Many more men would then tap into that because they tend not to have the kids in their household if they're not married, would become sort of more attractive marriage partners, less interested in crime, and that. So that's the big dimension where at the federal level they talk about it.
Yeah, we're certainly not seeing about it in the paper. Yes.
That's because the legislators have to. I think I think the other big factor is politicians want to do something about inequality because people are pissed. You don't have to raise taxes to raise the minimum wage. It still costs something, but you don't have to raise taxes. And the ITC, I mean, you know, a Republican in the federal government cannot do anything that entails raising taxes, right? Almost by rule now. So it's very hard to get behind it, right? In the current culture, until Grover Norquist goes his own way. Yes.
So that last comment is actually a perfect segue. I'm coming over from the law school. I do a lot of work with immigrant workers, and a lot of the story seems to be focused on the kind of bounded community of American workers, American families, and that's sort of how poverty is measured, right? The ability to support the people you love. But it's also true that immigrant workers have loved ones, but they just live overseas, and of course, the remittances can actually do much more for people there. And so one of the narratives I've been grappling with is, the minimum wage is actually maybe not doing a lot to fight poverty here, but it's actually doing a lot to fight poverty overseas. So I guess the big picture question I had is, in your work on the minimum wage, is there a kind of implicit or explicit commitment to nationalism, or this being framed as a purely sort of like a national benefit for insiders? Because I find that many of the people who are supporting the Fight for 50 are immigrants, but I'm trying to reconcile these competing narratives. So
Do they raise the issue of remittances? In your experience, do they raise the issue of remittances?
Yeah, I find that people often try and avoid that issue, but
Interesting.
The sort of reality is that to the extent that the minimum wage is doing any of that work, it is overseas where it has greater purchasing power. So I was just wondering if you encounter any of those sorts of issues.
No, it's a fair point. I have no idea what the numbers would actually add up to, and I don't know what. I'm not. I mean, there's a lot of. I'm not a development economist. There's a lot of research on remittances in other countries. I don't know that we collect any. We have any data to get a handle on this. But what you're saying is true. I mean, certainly immigrants are. I mean, they're a minority of the workforce. But as you say, $100 right in Guatemala is worth a lot more than $100 here. It's an interesting question. There are, I think there are some data sets where they sort of do these surveys of, at least the US and Mexico, like people who are connected or who go back and forth, where you could in principle, possibly even knowing what state the person here is working in, actually do the same kind of research design and potentially learn something about that. But I think you're right when you said, is there a nationalist perspective? I mean, not explicitly, obviously, we don't really talk about it that way. But yeah, the benefits, the sort of benefits and costs I'm sort of trying implicitly to add up here are US workers. And that happens, by the way, at the local level too. I mean, DC, when they talked about their minimum wage, I was commissioned by the Chamber of Commerce to do a study, and one of the things I pointed out was DC being so tiny, right, meant that a lot of the workers didn't even live in DC, right? And if the people who are living in DC are going to pay more of the cost and the benefits are going to go to people outside of DC, that might not be as attractive a policy. Now that's a narrow perspective, but that is one policymakers take.
Simon.
Hey David, is there any data on maybe inner city schools that have some sort of greater vocational bent to give them the skills where more people could reasonably create the value to not need assistance on what is a fair $15 an hour job? Is there any studies on more vocational high schools for that?
Yeah, there's a huge literature. It's probably bigger than wage literature on training generally. Because you're right. I mean, what you're saying is If we raise skill, I mean, I don't have the slide in my talk anymore, but I used to have a slide that said, the holy grail is raising skills, so we don't need this anymore. But we don't know how to do that. But we've run training programs. Trump, to his credit, and he's gotten some praise from Democrats on this, at least has talked so far about trying to beef up vocational training. Clinton had a big school to work initiative that Bush 2 killed. So these are, I mean, and some of these, I wouldn't say we have anything that's going to kind of raise you from 7 to 16. But I think there's some evidence that more vocational training is probably good for some people. My take on, used to do some work on school to work, and my take on it was we've sort of gone to an educational system with all the testing that is very much focused on those going to college. And if that's not right for you, and 40% of the population doesn't go to college, it's really not serving you very well, right? There's jobs you can get out there, skilled jobs, putting solar panels on that are going to pay you a lot more than working at McDonald's. And you got to train people how to do those things.
Yes.
Could you argue that raising the minimum wage would grow the economy? Because increased spending?
Well, you could argue it. People do, right, yeah.
It's not listed in one of your
Right.
pros of it.
So you hear that argument. I don't think, the only people I do hear some minimum wage advocates from the Economic Policy Institute, which is a big union-funded center in DC. They have some very good economists. They try to make that argument, but whenever I've been in a position to debate them and you call them out on that, they back off from that very quickly. And the reason is simply, the money doesn't come from nowhere, right? It's coming from somewhere. Now, the possible reason it could have a slight positive effect is in the short term is because the lower income people tend to spend a higher share of their income than higher income people. The marginal propensity to consume is higher. So in the short term, you might get a boost to consumption from doing that. Of course, in the long term, you might have less investment, which is not a good thing. So I don't think that argument, you see people make that argument, but I think that one is considered so weak and even made so seldom by at least the fairly serious advocates that I think, it could be on my slide, but that's why it isn't.
One last question, we'll
Jose.
wrap it up.
I like the work on the earned income tax credit, and I think the case is getting stronger and stronger comparing the two type of policy options. But one downside, I think, of the earned income tax credit is folks only realize that benefit once a year, after they're filed their taxes. Is there some way, any ideas, thinking outside the box on how you might be able to spread that
Right.
in smaller increments? throughout the year?
So here's an interesting fact. It's kind of unbelievable, and you definitely won't believe it because of your perspective. So it used to be until some number of years ago, not that many, that you had a choice. You could take your EITC with every paycheck, or you could just wait till the end of the tax year. At most, 2% of people chose the first option, right? So 98% of people wanted that lump sum at the end of the year. And economists are really puzzled about this, right? Because it's like people who are glad when they get a tax. My accountant used to apologize to me when I had to pay taxes at the end of the year. And I said, that's great, because otherwise I would have given the government a tax-free loan, for part of the year. So Jenny Romich, who's at the University of Washington, I think it was her dissertation, did this great study where they sat in, a lot of these, like A.F. Hutton and some of these tax companies provide low-income tax services, free tax services to the poor, probably hoping that when they're not poor, they'll start paying for it, or maybe they're just being nice. But they sat in on these sort of consults where people were doing their tax returns. And if you're low income, it takes like a half hour, right? It's simple. And they were interviewing them about why they chose this option. They could see, you're getting your EITC, you hadn't claimed it during the year. There are a couple reasons. So one of the reasons might be it's a little bit uncertain. Most of us have jobs that aren't going to end during the year. We don't really worry about that. If your employment is kind of variable and unpredictable, you might end up having to pay the government back some money depending on what happens. You might not like that if you don't have much money in the bank. But the bigger issue, and this is what most of them said, was they need forced saving mechanisms. They said when you're poor, or low income, poor is a little simple. When you're very low income, you still need big checks once in a while. Your car dies and you got to spend $2,000 for a used car, or you're changing apartments and you need first month's rent, last month's rent, maybe a security deposit. These folks don't have $2,000, $3,000 in the bank, and they use their EITC for that. So or a new refrigerator, whatever it might be. So even though that sounds like a disadvantage, when people had the option, they didn't want it. And so few took it, the federal government just said, you can't do it anymore because it wasn't worth sort of a lot, having the administrative structure for that option when only, a couple % were using it.
Thanks, everyone. I think it's gotten pretty late.
Okay.
So I'm going to let everyone go. Thank you so much for coming out and supporting the spree. It's great to see everyone. David, thank you so much.
Thanks.